The Republic of Turkey is a close ally of the United States. It is also a key member of NATO. It wants to join the European Union. The country finds itself in a region altered by the recent conflict between Russia and Georgia and sometimes the instability in Iraq. Joining me now is Ali Babacan. He is Turkey's foreign minister. He's also the chief negotiator for Turkey's efforts to join the European Union. He is in New York to attend the annual meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. I am pleased to have him at this table. We have met before. This is his first time here at the table, so thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you for the invitation.
Tell me what you hope to accomplish here. What's Turkey's objective in these conversations at this General Assembly meeting?
Turkey is a country which is trying to contribute to peace and stability in many parts of the world, but especially in its close vicinity. Turkey is a neighbor of Balkans, Caucasus, Middle East, Central Asia, and North Africa. And in the middle of such dynamic and vivid area, we have quite a busy foreign policy agenda, I would say.
So for those who say geography is destiny, maybe.
I would say exactly.
All right, let's talk first about Georgia, because that happened recently.
Sure.
Well, tell me how you think that crisis started, who provoked whom, and where is it now, and what is the role of Europe, Turkey, Russia, the United States, and the Georgians?
The Caucasus had many frozen conflicts for many years, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The problems in Abkhazia, in South Ossetia, in Nagorno-Karabakh, actually always existed there, but we refer them as frozen conflicts. And these conflicts are actually very risky because in a time where nobody expects, this could just turn into serious problems which influence not only the immediate neighborhood but in even far away place of the world. And there were already tensions going on between Georgia and South Ossetia, Georgia and Abkhazia. And these tensions then turned into tensions between Georgia and Russia, then into Russia-US tension, and eventually Russia-NATO tension. So a small region of the world where you don't really have that many people living, but then if these problems are not handled properly and timely, these could really erupt into events which are probably not expected or liked by anyone.
Who started it?
We never got into a blame game of who started, but it's, I think, no secret that this tension, this conflict was there for 17 years. And this was not addressed. This was not resolved. Russians were already ready, I would say, for some kind of a conflict. They were already militarily getting prepared for something bad. On the other hand, Georgians, they wanted to have more say and more control on Georgians living in South Ossetia. And when we just look at the sequence of the events, Georgians started an operation, but then it immediately turned into a response or a reaction by the Russians.
So the Russians was a reaction to a Georgian.
Then it is all the events which followed into probably events which nobody expected. So. Especially the fact that the Russian troops got out of South Ossetia and Abkhazia and getting into further deep into Georgia, I would say, was a real source of worry for all of us. And actually, it was the fourth day of the war that my Prime Minister and myself, we were in Moscow, talking with President Medvedev, Prime Minister Putin, and Foreign Minister Lavrov all together. And we had long discussion about how we can actually help stop the hostilities and let the diplomacy and political dialogue to work.
Your impression is the Russians are interested in what? What's the Russian agenda?
Now, it is not just one or two things. It does also have some history. I think a series of events like the independence of Kosovo, and then the fact that Georgia and Ukraine were being prepared to be members of NATO, and then the arrangements between the United States and Poland about the missile shields and so on. So all these steps, all these events, I would say, were taken as threats by Russia. And maybe they have history in those territories. It was part of Soviet Union, that we had Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and those were all parts of the Soviet Union.
It's clear from what Prime Minister Putin has said, former President Putin has said, and even President Medvedev, that they view the loss of the sort of Soviet empire as a continuing issue in their heart. Yes?
It is not enough to tell the whole story. I think we should all be aware of the new Russia. Russia is not any longer the Russia of 1990s. Sure. Russia is economically much stronger. There is now more of a stronger political leadership, I would say, and a Russia which feels the necessity to see more respect from the international community.
And how does the international community show that? What would the Russians like for them to say, do, behave in order to show respect for them?
I think it's important to be aware of Russia's strengths and the fact that Russia is now quite a major player globally. But on the other hand, it is important to see a Russia which is advancing in being a truly democratic country. It's important to see a Russia which is a responsible member of the international community. And as Turkey, we have growing trade relations with Russia. Now they are our largest trade partner.
Right. Do you favor the more and more nations joining NATO?
We are a NATO member from the very beginning, and we are strong supporters of having more and more countries in NATO.
Georgia and the Ukraine and others.
For Georgia and Ukraine, our position during the Bucharest summit was that if there is a consensus to invite these countries for a membership action plan, we would have joined the consensus. That was our...
If there is a consensus, you would join the consensus.
But then that consensus was never formed because especially old members of NATO in Europe were quite worried, I would say, about possible difficulties of going fast with these two countries, with Ukraine and Georgia. Okay, we can debate whether they were right or wrong, but ultimately there was no decision at the Bucharest summit. But then we also see NATO as a more and more of a political organization rather than being a simple military alliance, I would say.
With what role?
The kind of discussions that we are now making in NATO meetings are not very different from the discussions that are being made at the EU ministerial meetings. So NATO is now more and more discussing political aspects of the relations. And it is an alliance where more and more countries are sharing some common values, some common ideals. So in a way, having the Baltic countries, for example, in NATO, or having the Eastern European countries in NATO, in our view, was very important for them, first of all, to get into the security umbrella, and then this security umbrella would help them with their own internal reforms, because with maybe one or two exceptions, all of these countries are now also EU members. So in a way, they had to go through very detailed political and economic reforms. They had to adapt themselves to the EU acquis, all the rules and institutional structures of the EU. And especially when they switched from a communist system to a very different system, a guidance, a strong framework for those countries were very important. And EU and NATO provided them very strong frameworks for becoming truly modern nations and being truly belonging to the well-accepted understanding of the international community.
Because of Russia's economic strength and because of the consolidation of power in Moscow, do you see it having an impact on the alignment of countries in the Caucasus?
Actually, as Turkey, we had a proposal for a regional initiative in the Caucasus. And we first brought this idea up with the Russians, and then with Azeris, Armenians, Georgians. So a platform where we can have intense dialogue, where we can have targets, where we can have mechanisms for dispute resolution, and also where we have some common principles. A platform for stability and cooperation in a way. And Russians are very supportive of this idea right now.
And they would be a member of it. And they would be a member.
We don't even call it a member, but we call it some countries who are in the region coming together and being able to discuss the issues directly. Because Georgians and Russians, they have difficulty of communication. It's no secret. Yes, Azeris and Armenians, they can't talk to each other. Turkey and Armenia, we have serious problems. So the initiative which we have proposed was, in a way, being able to make countries sit around one table and openly discuss the problems and to try to solve the problems that they have among themselves. And this is not an exclusive structure. What we suggested is also open to a third country, a third countries, or an EU, let's say, or an OSCE, so that they can be with this structure, and there could be some linkages between the regional initiative and other international players, basically.
Is there still great enthusiasm for joining the European Union in Turkey?
For a while, the support for the EU in Turkey declined. And that was between, let's say, end 2006 to end 2007. So for 2 years, we observed a sharp decline. Like support was 75%, and nowadays it's only 50 to 55%. But for the last 1 year or so, now the support is not dropping anymore. Why it happened? First of all, the EU accession process helped us a lot in terms of political and economic reforms. Turkey in 2002 versus Turkey in 2007 are almost like two different countries. Our GDP increased from $230 billion to $660 billion. Our exports were only 36 billion, now it is more than 125 billion. Our budget deficit was 14%, now it is only 1.2% of our GDP. And FDI inflow increased dramatically from 1 billion a year to 20 billion a year, basically. So EU accession process brought predictability to Turkey. And EU accession process gave confidence to international investors. Also to Turkish investors to invest more in Turkey. But then we had some areas of problems with the EU during the time which I mentioned. We had German election process. And the leader of the #1 party in Germany, all throughout the campaign, said that Turkey does not belong to Europe. And then we had the French election process, during which the leader of the #1 party said almost every day that Turkey has no place in the European Union.
And so did President Sarkozy as a candidate.
Exactly. In a way, after we started the negotiations in 2005, immediately after then, two important countries like France and Germany started to have negative rhetoric about Turkey. And this confused Turkish people. On one hand, our negotiations started with the aim of full membership, with the consensus of all the member states. But just shortly after, we have been hearing these negative comments. And then we had the Cyprus issue.
Right.
Because of the Cyprus issue, 1/4 of the chapters are now blocked. And Turkish people thought that this is implementing double standards. Turkish people have been quite reactive to the issues surrounding the Cyprus issue. So all these three things caused the public support in Turkey to decline. It is more of an emotional response rather than anything else.
What role is Turkey playing in conversations between Israel and Syria?
Turkey is right now the sole mediator for the indirect negotiations that are taking place between Syria and Israel.
Is Turkey hopeful that these talks might lead to some successful completion between Israel and Syria and some settlement of the conflict and recognition of Israel and agreed on borders between the two?
So far, we see enthusiasm and strong political will with both of the countries. And why Turkey? Because the two countries, they have big problems of trust towards each other. But
yes.
Syria trusts Turkey, Israel trusts Turkey. And we do this by shuttling between the two delegations when they come to Istanbul. The two delegations, they never see each other. We already have 4 rounds of talks.
Right.
And our delegation shuttles in between 2 hotels to bring the positions together. And yes, one of the problems is borders or territories, but the other problem is security issues, sure, water issues, and normalization of relations.
President Ahmadinejad is here in New York. He was also in Turkey. Is it possible that Turkey can play a role as a kind of mediator between the West and especially the United States and the government of Iran?
I wouldn't call that a mediation role, but we are already playing a role of facilitating dialogue. After the 6 countries, including the United States, Russia, China, and the P5+1,
yeah,
when they offered this new package to Iran, the Iranians approached us and they asked us to play a role, not a named role, but a role. And then we started to talk with them quite frequently. I met with the Iranian foreign minister 10 times or so during the last few months. I met with President Ahmadinejad 3 times during the last few months. And when he came to Istanbul, our presidents talked, and also my prime minister talked with Ahmadinejad. And what we are trying to do is, if there is any misunderstanding or if there is any lack of communication because of cultural differences, because of any historical attachment, I would say that 6 countries would have difficulties with Iran. We are trying to fill those gaps. And we are talking with all the 6 countries. I have been talking with Condoleezza Rice so many times about this issue, with Sergei Lavrov so many times, with Steinmeier so many times, with David Miliband so many times, and with Bernard Kouchner so many times. So on one hand, we are talking with the 6. We are also talking with the Iranians, just to facilitate dialogue and bridge the gaps, basically.
In what way are you optimistic?
Now, we have a sense that Iranians are willing to get engaged in the negotiations process. But then it is important to talk about the conditionalities and how to get engaged and what are the next phases and so forth, which is, in my view, is important. But then on the other hand, the international community has doubts. International community has worries. And those doubts and worries has to be addressed. And it is very important to be in close cooperation with IAEA. It is very important to conform to NPT obligations. And also, it is important for the 6 to have a certain understanding and also respect for Iran and trying to get them engaged in a meaningful dialogue process. So we are neighbors with Iran and we are in a position to understand them well, I would say. But then, again, if there are doubts, those doubts have to be addressed properly.
And there are doubts in obviously in both places. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invitation.